Chapter 12, Through the Hollowed Halls, the LA County Jail, Part 2. During my first year in California, I grow closer to Erik. He quickly becomes my confidant and friend. He breaks through to me. I don't place walls between us, but I am also far from open. He pries gently, exposing the feelings I've locked up, clearing away small parts of the pain and self-doubt. One of the things that is important to me is how open he has been in discussing his past. The mystery surrounding a man can be attractive to some women, but Erik's life was too dramatic and awful to leave unmentioned and unexplained. If I am going to weather the punishment of any relationship with a prisoner, there is no room for a secret past, and there can't be topics that are off limits. I made it clear when I began our correspondence that I didn't believe he was treated fairly by the media, the justice system, or least of all his parents, but I also wasn't giving Erik a pass for his actions. Admittedly, I want to better understand how his tragedy came to pass. It seems at times that the last 30 years of Erik's life have been a general catastrophe, one that almost inevitably led to tragedy. Erik is anything but eager to explore his past. I think 2 trials lasting months at a time would cure anyone of that desire, but he understands my need to know him as well as he knows me. One spring day, our conversation returns to his years in the Los Angeles County Jail. We never finished our last conversation about the jail, and there were lots of questions I still wanted to ask. So you were in the holding cell, I say. When did you first begin to realize what you were up against in the jail? During the first few weeks, I got a sense of it, Erik says. You've got to remember that during this time, I wasn't doing all that well emotionally. I was 19, and it was a lot to deal with. On the one hand, I was wrestling with my personal demons, the fact of what I had done. The rest of the time, well, I was just trying to watch my back. I learned pretty quickly that the prisoners were divided, for the most part into 2 factions. There were Northern and Southern Mexicans, Crips and Bloods, the Aryan Brotherhood, and so on. Prisoners grouped up by ethnicity for protection. I also discovered that the people in jail were in an almost perpetual state of war with each other, and oftentimes with the deputy sheriffs that ran the jail. There was basically a razor-sharp line between green, the deputy's colors, and the prisoner's blue. A prisoner, or sheriff, crossed that line at his own peril. When did you first see Lyle? I asked. The next morning. I had already been transferred to another cell. That must have been a powerful moment. Erik nods. Yeah, it was. By the early morning hours, Erik had slumped against the corner of the cell and fallen asleep. He was still chained to the wooden bench. He had called out for his brother several times during that night, hoping to hear his familiar voice, but of course there was no reply. Despondent and exhausted, he turned in the chains that were wrapped around his wrists and left arms and folded himself in the corner to rest his head. He was startled awake by the turning of a large brass key in the door. The cell door swung open and a deputy stepped in. Without a word, he unchained Erik and then handcuffed him behind his back. Erik was walked through a series of halls and then down an enormous corridor. Each of its walls were covered by an intricate mural painted decades before by prisoners. Each step took him further into the heart of the jail. They entered another series of doors and gates, each security measured, with gates open and locked behind him. Before the next set could be opened, making for movements in fits and starts. Eventually, Erik found himself in a cavernous module with long, narrow rows of cells. On one of the rows, a cell door opened for him. Once inside, it closed behind him. His handcuffs were removed. Although safe enough to travel unattended on a flight to LA in the hours before, Erik was now regarded as a high-risk prisoner. The cell was extremely small, almost suffocating. He stepped to the bars. The hall was quiet and covered in darkness. Weary from having been awake for almost 48 hours, he sat down on his bunk. He huddled in the corner of the bunk bed and waited. A knocking on his cell bars stirred him a few hours later. It was his brother. Erik, wake up! He jolted awake. Lyle! He said in disbelief. Lyle's arms reached out for him. Erik hugged him through the bars and felt warm tears roll down his cheeks. He'd missed his brother. They tried not to cry, but their love for one another, the stunning turn of events, arrested, jailed, and faces splashed across the media, and their newfound circumstances made it difficult to contain the flow of emotions. Their reunion, however, could only be brief. Prisoners in that area of the jail were only allowed out of their cells for 20 minutes per day. Lyle had already been in jail for several days. I was worried, Lyle said. I didn't know where you were. I knew you were in Europe, but until you contacted Jerry, I wasn't sure. I couldn't reach you. I was afraid for you. Why? Because you wouldn't know what was happening, and you're my little brother. I was coming home, Erik replied, because they could be separate again at any moment. Lyle wanted to discuss their most pressing concern, safety. He wanted Erik to know the rules they need to abide by in order to survive in the jail. Erik, the only thing that's going to protect us in here is ourselves. You're going to meet with a jail senior deputy named Hostel. Don't engage with him any more than you have to. He's not friendly, and I'm concerned about where he'll move us. The jail's got a lot of hotspots, and the jailers here seem to care less about the media attention or whether we even make it to court. We're on our own. Lyle believed they should keep to a few guidelines. First, they could never rat out another prisoner. Second, they should never involve themselves in other prisoners' conflicts. Third, they should minimize friendships but spend energy forming necessary alliances. And lastly, and most importantly, they could never let another prisoner pressure or bully them. Ironically, these were similar to the principles their parents had taught them. Erik had recently turned 19, but he'd never been incarcerated before. We just need to survive, Erik told him. I don't know if they're going to separate us. We're each going to have to find a way to adapt and learn quickly in this place. Do you understand what I'm saying? I've already seen one man get stabbed. Erik understood, and he would learn the importance of Erik's words in the countless ways over the next 6 years. For the first 3 months, they were housed in relative isolation. Then overnight, everything changed. It happened after they arrived at the Santa Monica courthouse. Mid-morning, Erik's lawyer, Leslie Abramson, walked into the holding cell and said, "Planning on going somewhere, boys?" She went on to explain that a deputy sheriff claimed to have found a severed link in Lyle's leg chains. "What are they suggesting?" Lyle asked. "That the two of you were going to make a mad dash for the exit," Leslie answered. "But I just turned myself in," Erik said. "I know, but that's not stopping the DA from holding a big press conference right now, and I think things may get a little rough for you two back at the jail." Not until 6 years later would they learn that a sheriff's investigation had concluded no escape attempt had been made, but rather a deputy had planted the damaged leg chains in order to take credit for finding them. He was quietly fired for his misconduct, but on that day all the jailers believed was that Lyle and Erik had tried to escape, and they had a nasty welcome home party planned. When the sheriff deputies arrived at the courthouse to pick them up, they already decided to change the rules for transport. To begin with, they handcuffed Lyle and Erik behind their backs, rather than at their sides. Each cuff was tightened until it squeezed into their wrists, then the clamps were locked in place. Next, they were both placed in leg chains and then confined together on the transport van in a single cramped cage, with multiple patrol cars escorting them. The deputies drove a 2-hour route back to the jail. Several more deputies were waiting for them. They were taken to isolated holding cells inside the jail and still handcuffed, chained to the floor. Normally, at least one hand is freed while in a holding cell, and enough length on their chain is afforded for them to use the toilet, but not on this day. They remained on the floor of the holding cell for 7 hours. When they were finally removed, their wrists were swollen and discolored with red and purple markings. They were not returned to their cells. They were taken to a new housing unit, Section 1700, the rows A and C, one of the most dangerous and violent sections of the jail, often known as the Killing Rows. The leaders of the Southern Mexican Mafia, known as the EME, were kept here along with the heads and soldiers of every other major gang. They arrived at night, and as expected, in the cover of darkness, they were poorly welcomed by 2 deputies. Erik was told to face the wall. Lyle would be stripped first. Once Lyle was naked, one of the deputies claimed he was not moving his body fast enough while being searched. At the first blow against Lyle, Erik yelled his brother's name and charged for him, but he was slammed against the wall before he made his third step. Handcuffed, there was little Erik could do. Then, as suddenly as it began, the commotion stopped. The deputy stepped back. Immediately, Lyle was taken to row A. After Erik was body searched, he went to row C. For all its supposed security, the county jail was absurdly loose. Internal gang politics reigned in the face of the jail authorities. Some jail administrators sincerely tried to counter gang violence, but others ignored the problem and passively allowed violence to exist, perhaps believing nothing could be done. Sadly, their inactions served as an affirmative act with real consequences, and too many men were stabbed, raped, and killed. The jail began a festering wound on the cultural flesh, a flashpoint for gang conflict. While Erik and Lyle were housed in 1700, a power struggle among factions in the Mexican mafia erupted in the jail. All too often, in 1700, violence would erupt. Mon, a high ranking EME member who tried to keep Erik and Lyle out of hostilities, was stabbed 31 times in the attorney room by two rival EME members who had broken loose from their chains. Tensions blistered among the prisoners throughout the jail, and it all ended badly. I'd have thought they would keep you out of the most violent parts of the jail, I say to Erik. We talk about the worst things that happened to him there, and also about the lighter moments. Erik tells me he was eventually bounced around the jail until he landed in Unit 7000, specifically a row of 7 cells known as the hard cells. He was often the only prisoner kept in that section, but there were expectations. While he was there, a parade of well known prisoners stayed in Unit 7000, sometimes for weeks or months. Kelsey Grammer, Charles Keating, Christian Brando, Todd Bridges, Adam Rich, and O.J. Simpson. It reminded me of how many years were passing by. He recalled for me the day O.J. Simpson arrived. The jail had apparently been notified to expect him several days before Simpson's actual arrest. Erik was the only prisoner in the hard cell at the time and was ordered to clean out and prepare the cell next to him. That was on a Tuesday. Then, several days later, on the afternoon of the arrest, Erik watched the now infamous freeway chase, knowing the cell beside his was already reserved. Later that night, Simpson entered the hard cell unit. He was wearing jail blues and was handcuffed to a waist chain. Iron shackles restrained his legs, although he was surrounded by about 15 deputy sheriffs. He stopped in front of Erik's cell while two deputies entered and examined Simpson's cell. The most bizarre coincidence was that Simpson actually knew the Menendez family. Erik's father had pictures of the two of them at their home. Jose Menendez ran Hertz in the late 70s, and OJ was the star of their commercials. Hi, Erik, OJ said, waiting in front of the cell. He either recognized him or the officials told him who his neighbor would be. Long day, huh? Erik said, not knowing what else to say. Like you wouldn't believe. I guess I'll have time to tell you about it. Erik just nodded. The night Simpson arrived, security outside the hard cell tripled, but mostly the two were left alone. A single television had been positioned in the unit. The first 10 minutes of every newscast covered the latest development of the Simpsons case. The media had picked up on the accounts of Simpson's abuse against his wife. That infuriated him, Erik tells me. He kept yelling at the television that she had actually mistreated him. That was all a bit strange, but like everyone else, I didn't know whether he was guilty, and frankly, I wanted to stay out of his life, which was a little hard to do because we were the only two in the unit, and he loved to talk. You believe he did it? Well, yes, I guess so. After being in jail for a while, you get a sense of who's guilty or not from the way they behave. The innocent guys, as you'd expect, constantly profess their innocence and just can't get over the fact that the police arrested them. I mean, they're completely innocent, right? Guilty guys, on the other hand, usually just hem and haw about the quality of evidence against them. So I don't know. It was no barometer, just a gut feeling. OJ never once professed his innocence. I expected him to be screaming about it. But he never confessed either, and I sure never asked. We didn't have much to do. I read a lot and let him watch what he wanted. He was pretty obsessed with the newscast. I guess he'd never faced negative publicity before. It drove him to severe depression. He cried. Late at night, he cried. Maybe he missed his wife, or maybe he was just overwhelmed. For a while, I was concerned he might commit suicide. Jail breaks a lot of men, and I think it nearly broke him. Erik and I go on to talk about many other experiences he had in the jail. I am interested in what happened to him, but maybe even more interested in how the events affected him. While his stories are fascinating, I'm motivated more by the fact that I've come to love this man, and increasingly I'm beginning to believe I could spend my life with him. I want to know him better, and that means exploring the whole world within him. When I'm not with Erik, it's easy for me to forget that even in our technological age, our jails and prisons are still brutal battlegrounds, where people are treated like wild animals with shackles and chains. I don't have the answers for how things could be different. All I can know is that hearing the stories deeply affects and disturbs me. Our American jails and prisons are creating harder criminals.